Chapter 8, Training and Development. Bear with me, this chapter is a little bit long and involved, but it's actually quite interesting. I think I say that about all the chapters, but this one really is. One of the reasons that training is so relevant is that United States companies spend over $100 billion a year on it. In fact, in 2013, American companies spent over $164 billion just on training and development. And the average employee spends over 33 hours a year on training. You can also see the graph on the amount of dollars spent per employee over time. As you can see, it keeps going up. This is money spent on training per employee. So today we're going to learn about the training process. There are 4 steps in the training process. The first one is to conduct the training needs assessment, where we assess the training needs. The second is to consider characteristics of the trainees and the context, the organization and the context of the training. We'll get into that later. The third is to choose and administer the training method. At this point, we decide which method to use, and we go ahead and administer. And finally, conduct a training evaluation to see how well it worked. So our first step is the training needs assessment. A training needs assessment is the process by which an organization identifies the key factors in the organization that will support the training program, what needs to be trained, and who needs the training. I kind of broke that down into questions that you should ask yourself if you're conducting a needs assessment. The questions are, what resources do we have? Money, time. Which skills need to be trained? So what are the skills that need to be taught? Which employees need to be trained? Is it everyone, certain job descriptions, just the new workers, just the low performers? And what are these employees like? We can learn about their demographics and their learning styles and their work history in order to assess the training needs. So there are actually 4 steps in conducting the training needs assessment, and the first one is the organizational analysis. For step 1, we identify the broad set of issues with the organization that could help or hinder the effectiveness of the training program. This is where we think about resources. Step 2 is the job analysis. Here's where we think about the skills. We identify which tasks and KSAs need to be trained on. The third step is deciding who needs to be trained and learning about their individual differences or learning styles, what the current employees can do, and what their goals are. And the fourth step is the demographic analysis, which is the process of identifying the actual people, their education, age, personal characteristics like that. We'll move on to training goals, because during the training needs assessment, one of the important things is to identify the training goals. And the training goals are the statement of the purpose of the training and the end state of the trainee in behaviorally specific terms. So a training goal can't just be for the employees to do a good job. You can't say your training goal is make my employees better. Even something vague like make them faster or make them better at making coffee, too vague. We need behaviorally specific terms. For example, the ability to make different espresso drinks correctly in 2 minutes using the standard company equipment. This is specific. It says what to do, how long it needs to take, what needs to be used. It's very specific what the training goal is here. So training outcomes are what's important. The reason that we do training is for outcomes. We want transfer of training, which is the degree to which training leads to improvements in on-the-job behavior. If there's no improvement on the job, what's the point of doing the training, right? And if you kind of work backwards on this little flowchart thing, you can see that the training outcomes are affected by the motivation in yellow. And training motivation is affected by both individual characteristics and organizational characteristics. So the individual characteristics are the characteristics of the workers. Their intelligence, remember general intelligence is expressed with a lowercase g. their personality, such as their big 5 traits, their learning style, if they like to learn by reading or by listening or hands-on, and the KSAOs that they possess, right? Their knowledge and skills. Also, the organizational characteristics affect motivation, such as rewards, the learning, training climate, the culture of the organization. Does the organization really value its top performers? Does it value improvement and reward this appropriately? Together, the individual and the organizational characteristics lead to training motivation. And the higher the motivation, the more likely we are to have transfer of training, which is actual outcomes on the job, such as increase of knowledge, skills, the transfer of training onto the job, and others. So by understanding the individual differences between the people, we can make a better training program. But it's also important to understand what's going on in the organization. Okay, here's a big slide about individual differences. This is a reminder that we're in a psychology class here. This is the stuff I like best. On the left side, with all those thumbs ups, you can see all the things that can improve motivation, can improve training outcomes by improving motivation. So the first is employees with greater general cognitive ability are better able to learn the material. They learn it more quickly. Secondly, people who are high in openness to experience, extroversion, and conscientiousness tend to succeed in training programs. Remember, we talked about the Big 5 a few chapters ago. We talked about how employers look for conscientiousness and they look for openness to experience, but really these are the things that also affect their success in training. Openness to experience, extroversion, and conscientiousness. Those are the 3 of the Big 5 that lead to success in training programs. Something else that can lead to success in training programs is learning self-efficacy. This means the person's belief that they can do it. If they think they can do it, they're more likely to do it. Finally, we have locus of control. Locus of control, if you have an external locus of control, that means you think that things are out of your control, that the universe is deciding things for you and there's not much you can do. An internal locus of control means that you think you have control of what goes on and you can affect things. And of course, there's a range between the two, but the more internal somebody's locus of control is, the better they respond to training because they think that it's important, right? They think they can affect their behavior, and they do. Moving over to the right-hand side, we'll still talk about some more issues with some more individual differences. Goal orientation is the type of goal that a person has when they're learning. And there's 2 types of goal orientation during training. One is the learning goal orientation, where the person really wants to learn the material. They're interested in learning it and understanding it. And second is the performance goal orientation, where the person doesn't care as much about actually knowing the material as they do about performing well. And of course, these are tied into each other, and the more you learn, the better you'll perform. But if you consider the type of student who only cares about their grades and not about actually learning the material, they probably won't learn as much as the student who's really focused on learning the material. And as you can see underneath, it says employees who are only performance-oriented aren't as successful with training. Finally, metacognitive skills is the ability of learners to assess their own learning, to be able to tell if you're getting it or not. And it's been found that high performers are better at this, and low performers actually overestimate their abilities. They think they're better than they are. They're not as accurate with their assessment of where they're at. And of course, it's important to have metacognitive skills and be able to self-assess in order to learn. I know there's a lot on this page of individual differences. Feel free to pause and take a little look at this page. It's an important one. Now we're going to discuss organizational context. So remember, we're discussing the things that affect motivation, and motivation affects the outcomes. The 2 things that affect motivation are individual differences and organizational context. We just talked about the people, now let's talk about the organization. We'll do this by discussing a series of terms. The first one is psychological fidelity. This is the degree to which the training elicits the KSAs needed to do the job. So how similar is the training to the actual skills needed for the job? Second is physical fidelity, which is the degree to which the training resembles the physical aspects of the job. Of course, having both of these would be best. Identical elements are the degree to which the training context is similar to the transfer environment. So this sort of incorporates those first two. How similar is your training environment to your work environment? Remember, transfer is where you transfer what you learned in your training to your actual on-the-job skills. Of course, the closer it is to identical, the better. Transfer through principles is kind of an interesting way of training. It's training employees to understand why they should perform their job a certain way, the underlying principles behind what they do. And it's been found that if employees really get why they're doing it, they do a better job at it. They really do. So it helps if you can train the employees in the values of the company and why the work they're doing is important so they can value their job and do it better. Finally, transfer climate is the degree to which the social climate among employees back in the work situation supports the training. So this would be like if the new employees go to a training and they tell them, okay, every time you make a drink, you need to clean the blender. But then they go back to work and they find out that all the employees there have an agreement that they clean the blender for each other. Whoever makes the drink, the other person cleans the blender. This is different than what you learned in training, so the transfer climate is not a good one here. You can't do what you learned in your training because all the employees at work, all of your coworkers are doing something different. So the best way to ensure that the training transfers after the training is administered is to provide a good transfer climate. Get rid of those obstacles, get rid of those coworkers doing something different. Secondly, we want to provide support to supervisors so they can help their employees and they understand what's been taught in the training and how it can be reinforced in the workplace. Thirdly, we can use real-world debriefs where employees discuss how they've applied what they learned back on the job. So they would come back to a training session afterwards maybe and tell the trainer what they've done in the workplace differently since their training. And finally, you can provide support to employees like access to databases or resources, reminders if they forget stuff. Often trainers will provide the slides afterwards so employees can go back and reference them. And I want to go back for a second just so we can look at the pictures. On the last slide, we saw a girl doing a virtual training, a simulation. And simulations are really good kinds of training because they have a lot of psychological and physical fidelity. They get as close to being identical as the transfer environment as possible, as close to that transfer environment as possible with the simulation. And as you can see, she's simulating driving, and then when she goes into the workplace, I know it's not the same girl, but when she goes into the workplace and actually drives, we need to make sure that we're providing this good transfer climate and we're providing support and reminders of what she learned on the job, and maybe even bring her back into the training to talk about how she implemented her new skills on the job. All right, let's talk about motivation now. We talked about how the individual differences and the organizational context both lead to trainee motivation, and then the motivation is what leads to outcomes. Motivation is largely governed by meaningfulness. Meaningfulness is the degree to which the training is seen as relevant to the workplace or the learner. If the trainers don't think this is a good training, they don't think it's relevant, they don't think it's important, they're probably not going to take very kindly to it. They're not going to learn as much. It's important to understand the individual differences that we talked about and what motivates different employees. We also want to keep the goals specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. If you look at the first letter of each of these words, it spells out the acronym SMART. So we keep our goals SMART. They're specific, right? We don't just say get better at their job. We give specific goals. We give measurable goals, because later we're going to talk about evaluating if the training worked. We need to be able to measure our goals. Attainable goals means it's something that the trainees can do. If they're not capable of doing it, the whole thing's pointless. Relevant goals, right, that are relevant to doing their job. And timely goals. Timely in terms of how long they've been on the job, what's expected of them at this point. Expectancy theory tells us that trainees must believe that if they try, they'll be able to master the material, and that if they master the material, it will lead to an outcome that they want. Performing well at their job, getting a raise, keeping the position, whatever it is that they want, their desired outcome. So expectancy theory is important. That's sort of the whole motivation behind the training. The trainees have to believe that this is a doable thing, and if they do it, it'll be good for them. Finally, keeping stress down will increase motivation. We don't want training to be stressful, that's for sure. All right, here are some learning concepts that are important in training. We can learn with spaced learning, where you do small sessions spaced out over a period of time, and this is much better than the next type, which is called mass learning. Mass learning is where you learn everything in one big long session or 1 week of sessions. It all happens in a condensed version. It's faster, it's often cheaper. If you're flying in a expert trainer from somewhere else, you can't necessarily bring them in once a month for a whole year. You would just want to bring them in for a week or two straight and do it all at once. So mass learning can be a lot faster and cheaper, and therefore it's very common. But spaced learning is a lot better because it spaces out the sessions and really results in a lot better learning. Down to the yellow box, we'll talk about feedback. Feedback is providing learners with information about how they're doing, leading to their knowledge of the results. So the whole time, you're giving them feedback on how they're doing rather than waiting until the very, very end and saying, okay, you got a B, right? You let them know how they're doing. This is really important for learning. I'm sure, as you know, as a student, it's helpful if your professors give you feedback as you're going and don't just wait until the end of the whole semester to give you your grades on everything. In the green box, we talk about learning schema. A learning schema is a framework for organizing what you're learning. So it's really good to sort of start out training with an outline or a table of contents or a short presentation that explains what the training is going to be and how everything fits together. Overlearning sounds like it might be a bad thing, but it's not. It's when the trainee practices something so much it becomes totally automatic. And finally, decay of learning, which is a bad thing. That's the process in which learned knowledge or skills or behaviors become less accessible over time. So as you can imagine, or I'm sure you've experienced, when you learn something new, you may not remember it as well as the years or months go by. Decay of learning. And of course, a good way to combat decay of learning is with booster training sessions, where you remind the employees of what they were taught in the original training. All right, here are some different methods of training. We are almost at our last part. There's on-the-job training, which is pretty self-explanatory. You go do your training on the job. Machine simulation is a training environment that reflects the job situation as closely as possible, both psychologically and physically. So remember I showed the driving simulation, right? A machine simulator is good because it really mimics the job situation as closely as possible for training if you're not going to be on the job. And in a lot of cases, it's safer to do a machine simulation, such as a flight simulator. We don't want to put people who've never flown before up in real airplanes. Lecture, as you would expect, is the oral presentation of information. Sometimes this can be a two-way discussion with feedback. Sometimes it's purely just a lecture. Programmed instruction is training where you go through the material one module at a time and you need to pass a little quiz as you go in order to get to the next module. And this can be done in two ways. With linear programmed instruction, which is pretty simple. You just read the module, pass the test, do the next module, pass the test, do the next one. Branching programmed instruction is a little bit different. Depending on how you score on the test, they may have you review just part of the module or the whole module or do a whole separate remedial module. It's more specific and, as you can imagine, works better. Over on the side, we can see the debriefing is talking with trainees about what happened in the training program, what could have been done better, and what was learned. And it's important to try to find a balance between the learner needs and the organizational constraints. So when we're choosing a method, of course we want to use the method or methods that work best for our trainees, but sometimes that doesn't work for the organization. Sometimes it's too costly, or it just doesn't work with this kind of job. They don't have the materials, whatever. Behavior modeling training is a different type of training where you actually watch somebody do the task in front of you. So behavior modeling training is also called BMT, and it's based on Albert Bandura's social learning theory. He has a theory of modeling, which is that when you see somebody do something, you may copy them. You do copy, not always, but you're likely to copy them. And BMT is typically used to train really complex skills, behaviorally complex skills. An example would be interpersonal skills, right? Not something so much like making a coffee, but something more like handling customers. It's often used as part of supervisor training to show the supervisors how to handle the employees. And it's done by learners observing a person performing or modeling the desired behavior. And then after they observe, a learner or several learners will role play a similar situation, and then they get feedback from each other and from the trainer, and they'll do it over again. It is a really good way to learn, and it uses a proven psychological principle of social learning. Finally, we have diversity training, which is focused on the better functioning of diverse groups of employees. It includes sensitivity to different groups, and diversity training improves trainee affect, their attitudes and motivation. Diversity training's also been proven to improve skill-based behaviors and knowledge, but it has to obviously be done well. All right, we'll discuss some types of managerial training methods, which include executive coaching, where the manager works individually with a coach. Developmental assessment centers, which were similar to the assessment centers we discussed in a previous chapter, but this is only for training, not for promotion decisions, deciding, raises or anything like that. It's just for training, but they go into the assessment centers and they get feedback, and it's a training center, basically. Business games or simulations is where they'll create a competition among groups of business teams, which can improve their decision making. Role play, where they act out challenging situations. Cross-cultural training, which is important for managers who need to have international assignments. They need to travel or manage people from a different culture. And finally, case study analysis, which is an in-depth analysis of a particular business case. So this would be a very specific training program for a manager at a certain organization. Another aspect of training that organizations need to deal with is called new employee onboarding. Onboarding is the process through which employees become familiar with both the tasks and the social demands of their new job. NEO, New Employee Orientation, is a training process that presents basic information to new employees to get them up and running and ready to contribute to the organization as quickly as possible. And it's important to evaluate your onboarding program, and we're about to get into how we evaluate training programs in general. Evaluating is important to make sure that the program is effectively helping new employees, because if you don't have a good training for your new employees, then you're really in trouble. And you can also assess the employees' reactions you can do this by assessing employees' reactions to the program, the level of knowledge they have at the end of the onboarding program, their behavior, and the business outcomes. These are all the different ways to assess their training, and we're going to talk about that more now. We're going to discuss Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training criteria. So now we're heading into our final section of the chapter, which is how to evaluate the training programs. We assessed the needs, and we chose our methods, and now we are ready to evaluate how it worked. Okay, so it's done now. We need to see how it worked. And there's 4 levels of criteria which can evaluate a training program. The first one is the reactions of the trainees. This one's not that important. Did they like it? Did they say they learned something? It can be valuable information, but just asking them, was this a good training, isn't a great measure of evaluation. The second is learning, right? Did they learn something? You can test them right away on what they learned. You can give them different types of tests in order to tell what they learned from the training. But that's not quite as important as our third level, which is the actual behavior on the job. Because even if they learned all of the facts and they remember everything you told them, if it doesn't transfer to the job, then it's not worth it. So are they putting what they learned in training to use in the workplace? And even more important than that is our level 4, which is results. Is it working out? Is this a good thing that they're doing it in the workplace? Are they getting more work done? Is it increasing profits? Are customers happier? Right? Is it getting the outcome that we want, which is job performance? These 4 levels of training criteria have actually been criticized a little bit because they're very, very broad. When we really evaluate a training program, we need to be more specific in our evaluation than just these broad measures, but it's a good starting point. When we evaluate training programs, the most important thing really to consider is the validity of the program, the validity of our evaluation, So we do the training program and then we study the training program to see if it works, right? Basically, we, for example, do a performance evaluation on a group of employees, then we train them, and then we do another performance evaluation and see if their performance has improved, right? But when we're doing these studies, there's a lot of things that can threaten the validity of the study. Sometimes it might look like a training program worked and it didn't. So let's talk about why. A threat to experimental validity is a factor which may affect our ability to interpret the results. So that's what I was just saying. It's threatening the experiment itself. It's threatening the integrity of the experiment, the validity of the experiment. And threats to internal validity are factors that can cause us to have concerns with the accuracy of the results themselves, whereas threats to external validity are threats to the generalizability of the results. So the internal validity is the validity of the experiment itself. Are we measuring the right thing? Is the change caused by the training like we think it is? And then external validity is the ability to generalize what was learned in the training to the real world. Let's talk about the types of internal validity threats. There's a lot of them in the little chart on the left in red. One is called history, and history means something that happens in between the pre-test and the post-test. So remember, we do the performance analysis, we see how the employees are doing, then we train them, and then we test them again and we hope that they perform better. But what if during this time period they also got a raise? Maybe they're performing better because they're making more money. Secondly is maturation. Maybe they're performing better because they've matured, they've gotten stronger or older or more used to the job. Or they take their job more seriously, so they perform better, but it's not because of the training, it's because of maturation or because of what happened in history during that time. Third is testing. The issue can be, how do we test what they learned? Are we testing it properly? Next is instrumentation. Are we measuring it the same way? If we didn't measure their skills the same way in the pre-test and the post-test, that will certainly threaten the validity of the experiment. At the bottom of the left side, we'll see statistical regression to the mean. This is a tendency that people have in general to test. When you test them a second time, they get closer to the mean. So high scorers go down and low scorers go up. This doesn't always happen, and this can be accounted for by different types of experimental design, but it's important to make sure it's not happening, that everybody's just going closer to the middle. Over to the right-hand side of the internal validity threats, we have differential selection of participants. That's randomization. We need to have a control group, right? A group who's not being trained so we can compare. And if we didn't randomize which people go in the control group and which people go in the experimental group, we're going to have a problem because for example, maybe we put all of our lowest performers in the training group because they need the training most. But then they might not increase as much, their performance might not increase as much because they're the lower performers to begin with. Next is experimental mortality. This means people who drop out of the study. It could be because they actually die, or more likely because they quit or got fired or retired or no longer work at the job anymore or don't want to take part in the training anymore. Compensatory equalization is where the control group who's not getting the training gets something extra because maybe the trainer feels bad for them that they're not getting any of this training, so he lets them all go out for ice cream instead. And now they're motivated because they got to have ice cream and they perform better on their job, but it's not because of the training, it's because of the ice cream. They didn't even get any training. But it makes it look like they're improving too, so it looks like the group who is getting the training didn't improve as much. Next, we have resentful demoralization. That's where the group who's not getting the training resents that they're not getting the training. They start to perform even more poorly because they're upset that they're not getting the training program, and then it looks like the group who did get the training program is performing better, but it's really that the control group is performing worse. And finally, diffusion of treatments is where the experimental group who actually gets the training teaches their coworkers what they learned, and it diffuses. So now everybody's performing better, even the people who didn't take part in the training, and that's because they learned from their friends. Over to external validity threats. Both of these also reference the control group and the experimental group. So I'll just remind you real quick that the control group is a group of employees who does not receive the training. They still do the pre-test and the post-test like the experimental group, but we use them as a source of comparison to be sure that the training is what caused the difference. So external validity threats can include reactive effects of pre-testing. So this is where the training worked because the trainees got the pre-test and paid greater attention to the material related to it during the training. So it looks like they learned something from the training, but they really learned something from the pre-test. And secondly, reactive effects of the experimental setting. So this is like the Hawthorne effect, where the people in the group who get trained know that they're part of a study, so they try harder. The people in the control group are not getting trained, so they have no motivation to try harder at their job. All right, I believe this is the last slide. And then of course we have our review. This is the design of our evaluation for testing programs. It's the experimental design. So experimental rigor is the degree to which threats to validity can be eliminated as the cause of a study's results. So all of those threats to validity that we just discussed, let me go back for a moment. All of these threats of validity can affect the employee's work, right? For example, let's think about maturation, right? If you hire somebody to do construction work and over the months they get stronger and stronger from doing the work, eventually they'll be able to do their work quicker or more efficiently. But this isn't because of a training program, it's because of maturation. So we need to be able to eliminate these issues. There are different ways that we can eliminate these threats to validity, and the more we've eliminated those threats, the more experimental rigor we have. So rigor is a good thing. Rigor is when we're sure or close to sure that our training is what changed the training group's outcomes. And it's not something else. It's not one of those threats to validity. So rigor can be increased by using control groups, by random assignment, and by the use of pre-tests. Let's first discuss a pre-experiment. Pre-experiments are not experiments. They're not rigorous. There's no control group. And they tell us if the KSAs are present. They tell us if the group that got the training has the skills when they're done. But it doesn't tell us if they had the skills when they started. So it's kind of pointless because you may have done the training for nothing. If you look over in the design column where you see all those T1s and T2s, let's look in the orange row where we're talking about the pre-experiment, which is not an experiment. The very top one has no pretest at all. So there's no control group in any of them. There's never a group who doesn't get training. That X represents the training. They're both, the only group that exists gets the training. Sometimes there's a pretest and sometimes there's no pretest. So in the first design, we have no pretest, then we have training, and then we have the post-test. All we're knowing is if the people who went through the training have the skills for the job. We don't know if they improved or anything. The second one, where it says T1 x T2, it does have a pretest, T1, followed by the training, X, followed by a post-test. So it can tell us if the group improved, but it still doesn't tell us if they improved because of the training. Perhaps they improved because of maturation, or because they got a raise, or because they like their job better now. We don't know because we don't have any control group. Which leads us to a true experiment. This is the best kind. The true experiment is what you're always going for. It's the most rigorous. We can be sure in a true experiment that the effects are really because of the training. And the best type of true experiment is called a Solomon foursquare. It's the best kind. It can be impractical because it involves 4 different groups, but it really is the best. So if you look at the design, all those R's mean that there was random assignment. If you look up at the pre-experiment in the orange, there was no random assignment because there was only one group. Now we have 4 groups and each one has random assignment. So our first group gets a pre-test and a post-test, but no training. That's our control group. The second group gets a pre-test and a post-test with training. And we can compare these 2 groups to see if the training made a difference. But then they add something even better. Those first 2 are a true experiment. With just those first 2 groups, it still counts as a true experiment. It's still very good. But they add something even better to account for the possibility that the pre-test affected things. Remember we talked about how maybe they learned something from taking the pre-test, or maybe they got motivated by taking the pre-test? So we add 2 more groups, one who gets training and one who doesn't, and these guys don't get pre-tests. So I'll review those 4 groups in the design again. We have pre-test, no training, post-test. Then we have pre-test, yes training, post-test. Then we have no pre-test, no training, just a post-test. And no pre-test, yes training, just a post-test. And all of those groups have their participants assigned to them randomly. So this Solomon foursquare is the best way to design an experiment. Please reach out to me if you'd like more information on it. It's quite interesting and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Finally, a quasi-experiment is an almost experiment. It's in between those top 2. It's much better than a pre-experiment, but not quite as good as a true experiment. A quasi-experiment has good or okay rigor, depending on the experiment, but it's not the most rigorous because it's not a true experiment. Usually what makes a quasi-experiment not a true experiment is that it's not randomly assigned. So if you look at that first design in yellow, we have T1, T2, that's pre-test, post-test, no training, and pre-test, post-test, yes training. So that's a control group and an experimental group, but you'll notice there's no R's next to them because they're not randomly assigned. Underneath is an interesting model which accounts for maturation because it takes just one group of people, but it measures their abilities or their skills or their performance at time 1, then again at time 2, then again at time 3, then they administer training, then again at time 4, again at time 5, and finally they measure them at time 6. And they see if their performance changes significantly between time 3 and time 4, as opposed to those other times, because that's when the training was administered. If you can see that their abilities increase steadily throughout all of those times, then it's because of maturation or learning on the job and not because of training. But if it really jumps between time 3 and time 4, then we know it's that training, that X in there. Again, feel free to pause and take a close look at these different evaluation designs. And remember that, of course, the true experiment is the best, and it only needs those top 2 groups in order to qualify as a true experiment. All right, that last slide was a doozy. Thank you for hanging out with me and putting up with all of this. We are finally on the review. I will do my best to go nice and quick. And remember, this is the best slide to have up when you are doing your quizzes and exams. Chapter 8 review. The training process involves conducting a training needs assessment, then considering the trainee characteristics and the organizational context. Thirdly, we choose and administer the training method or methods. And finally, conduct the training evaluation. Those are the 4 steps of the training process. So the first step is the training needs assessment. And the training needs assessment has 4 steps of its own. We do the training needs assessment to identify the resources and who and what need to be trained. And we do this by first conducting the organizational analysis, then the job analysis, then the person analysis, and finally the demographic analysis. Training goals are a statement of the purpose of the training and the end state of the trainee in behaviorally specific terms. So remember, the goals have to be specific in terms of what behaviors are desired. Transfer of training is the degree to which training leads to improvements in on-the-job behavior. How does it actually transfer to the workplace? Factors that increase training efficacy, how well the training works, include general cognitive ability, people who are smarter train better, openness to experience, conscientiousness, and extroversion. Other things that help people train better include self-efficacy, internal locus of control, and a learning goal orientation as opposed to the performance goal orientation. Metacognitive skills are the ability of learners to assess their own learning and mastery of the material. We've found that high performers are better at this and low performers have poorer metacognitive skills. They often overestimate their abilities. And of course, having metacognitive skills, having good metacognitive skills is very important for training. Psychological fidelity is the degree to which the training elicits the KSAs needed to do the job. So how similar is the training to the actual knowledge and skills needed for the job? Physical fidelity talks about how similar the physical aspects of the training are to the physical aspects of the job. Identical elements is the degree to which the training context is similar to the transfer environment. Transfer through principles is when employees are trained to understand why they should perform their job in a certain way, and this helps them do it. Transfer climate is the degree to which the social climate among employees back in the work situation supports training. This is about the coworkers and the climate back at work. To increase meaningfulness and motivation, we can reduce stress, make sure training goals are always SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely, and include expectancy theory, which is that, or consider expectancy theory, which is that trainees believe or need to believe that if they try, they will be able to master the material and it will lead to the outcome they want. Expectancy theory is important in successful training. Over to the right-hand side, spaced learning is when the training is in small sessions spread out over a long period of time. Massed learning is the delivery of training in a condensed session or sessions. Feedback is where we provide learners with information on how they're doing, leading to knowledge of their skills, which leads to their knowledge of their results. Eventually they'll know their results on how they're doing, but the whole time you're telling them feedback. A learning schema, which is a framework for organizing what you're learning, such as an outline. Overlearning, which is a training approach where we practice the behavior so much that it becomes automatic. Decay of learning, which is a bad thing. That's where learned knowledge and skills and behaviors become less accessible over time. Kind of like forgetting. I'll move on to discussing different types of training now. There's on-the-job training, machine simulation, a lecture, programmed instruction, which you remember is where the material is presented in modules and you have to pass the quiz to get onto the next module. This can be done in a straightforward linear method, or it can be done with branching, where depending on how you score on your quiz, you may have to review the whole module or just part. Onboarding is a process through which the employees become familiar with the tasks and social demands of their new role or their new job. New employee orientation programs are a training process that present basic information to new employees, help them get up and running and ready to contribute to the organization as quickly as possible. We'll move on to evaluating the training programs. We can evaluate using Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training criteria: the trainee reactions, assessment of their learning, doing the behaviors in the actual workplace, and then of course job results, which are the most important. Are they getting better results now that they have applied their learning to the workplace? Some threats to internal validity of a training evaluation are factors that can cause us to have concerns with the accuracy of the results. So this is when we're not sure if the training program is actually what's causing the difference in skills, right? We evaluate the employees before and after their training, but maybe something else is causing the change, not the training. Threats to external validity are threats to the generalizability of the results because the training was done in a particular setting. Experimental rigor is the degree to which threats to validity can be eliminated. So rigor is a good thing. When we eliminate these threats to validity, we can be more and more sure that the cause of the results is our training program, and that's good. And we can increase rigor by using control groups, random assignment, and pre-tests. So remember that Solomon Foursquare had everything. It had control groups, random assignment, and pre-tests, and even groups that didn't have pre-tests, so we could look at the difference. All right, there you have it, our chapter on training. I hope you learned a lot. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions or if you'd like some more information, and good luck.